Today, a former nurse faces trial after being accused of multiple baby murders.
She spoke once throughout the entirety of the 80-minute hearing, and that was to confirm her name.
Last week, it would be last Monday, in fact, when I last met with Ms. Letby. That is a final meeting in what has been 2 years of support in preparation for this case, in which there has been a massive improvement in her position and her ability to cope. That has been, if I can put it this way, blown away by what has happened. On Friday afternoon last week, she was moved from where she had been in Bronzefield for some time to HMP Newhall in Wakefield, about 45 miles from here, without any of her possessions, without even a brush or toiletries or clothing, without any of the support regime that she has been provided with, and has been left in an utterly disorientated state. She is incoherent. She cannot speak properly, and we would say she cannot think clearly at all. This morning, she struggled to find the word for jury when discussing or trying to speak about what was happening. There was barely any speaking at all, almost nothing. That is not willful. She wishes to proceed. I impress this upon your lordship. Ms. Letby has been preparing for trial. She wants to have her trial. We want her to have her trial. The move that has taken place at such short notice, after we have spent months asking for this to be done beforehand because of her need to adjust, has been highly damaging and traumatizing.
Cheshire Police and the Crown Prosecution Service had a clear and compelling story to tell. An angel of death on the neonatal unit. Prior to the trial, they had arranged a press conference for invited journalists. From the first full day of the trial, the headlines screamed murder. For Lucy's defence, they had to tell a much less interesting story. A neonatal nurse working lots of overtime with specialist intensive care training was, understandably, often there when bad things happened, but she didn't do anything wrong. They did at least have the RCPCH and other reports that illustrated the staffing and skills shortages, along with evidence of systemic failings. But Judge Goss ruled this inadmissible. He explained that all the evidence has to be of direct relevance to the particular baby who is being considered.
As far as the defence can put anything by way of evidence into the trial, they need to be showing that there are other possible explanations for collapses, and those other possible explanations aren't necessarily that there is some other perpetrator that is murdering children. It might just be that the conditions are such that babies are more likely to collapse or have adverse health consequences. And that's an important thing, I think, for a jury to know.
Before you accuse me, take a look at yourself.
Ollie Buxton is a commercial lawyer whose blog, The Jolly Contrarian, has drawn praise from across the legal world.
If there's a Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report identifying major systemic problems during the period in question, this is something that the defence will want to put in evidence to establish their case that there is a better alternative explanation than a serial killer nurse for these collapses. that wasn't allowed. Because the report didn't specifically call out any incident on the charge sheet, the court ruled it irrelevant.
The biggest maternity investigation in NHS history has found yet again services were chronically understaffed and women weren't listened to.
But if systemic issues really had created these negative outcomes, and we now know they did in comparable NHS units elsewhere, then the defence was unable to run a key defensive line. They had a real problem here.
So, as in the police interviews, it was now on Lucy Letby, a lowly nurse, to provide an alternate medical explanation for every unexpected collapse, without being able to submit evidence, such as the consultants only doing rounds twice a week, not twice a day, and thus potentially missing all the warning signs. But the defence wasn't just blocked regarding systemic factors. In 2026, the BBC's File on 4 broadcast harrowing individual experiences of mothers on the Chester maternity and neonatal units during and after the time Lucy Letby was working there. Perhaps most shocking of all, File on 4 found that when her defence later sought the specific maternal notes for the babies in the trial, the prosecution refused to disclose them.
It just astonished me. I was just amazed. I couldn't think of any circumstances for how that would happen, what the rationale would be for the Crown Prosecution Service and the investigating team to say, well, they've asked for this material, we're just not going to give it to them. I'm just astonished as to why that would happen.
Dr. Steve Watts, who used to be the lead for the investigation of deaths in healthcare settings, considers these notes would have been critical for Lucy's defence.
It's blindingly obvious that the obstetric notes would have a bearing upon the health and survivability of neonatal babies going forward.
Then there was the infamous duty chart. The court was shown that Lucy was always there when bad things happened. But there were a lot more events than those in the chart. What was the explanation as to how the events had been chosen?
One may be that having selected particular events and looked at them, it turns out that Ms. Letby was present on each occasion. An alternative would be that Ms. Letby was, in effect, the parameter for selection of cases.
Did the chart simply show Lucy was there whenever Lucy was there? But the prosecution said this information was irrelevant. Judge Goss agreed they did not need to disclose it. The reasons for why those events were chosen, and not dozens of others where Lucy may not have been there, remained shrouded in mystery. With general and specific evidence barred, then Judge Goss also ruled that any defence witnesses would have to wait until every prosecution witness had been heard for every single charge, a process that would take months. And so, week by week, the prosecution had the floor to itself. Defence barrister Ben Myers was not yet allowed to introduce his own experts, only cross-examine theirs. Having offered his services to Cheshire Police, the main prosecution witness, Dowie Evans, had invoiced them for the many reports he had written over 5 years. In court in November, he was challenged about 8 of them concerning baby C. Evans had pointed to an X-ray taken on the 12th of June 2015 as evidence that air had been deliberately forced down the nasogastric tube. The problem was that it had only just emerged that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty on the 12th, or indeed from the day the baby was born until then. So, on the stand, Dr. Evans now said that her attack had actually happened the day after the incriminating X-ray that had led to the original accusation.
What's the evidence you rely upon when you tell the jury that the diaphragm was splintered on the 13th? What's the evidence?
Baby collapsed, died.
A baby may collapse for any number of reasons. What's the evidence that supports your assertion, made today, that it's because of air going down the NGT?
The baby collapsed and died.
Do you rely upon one image of that?
This baby collapsed and died.
Atechi Dowie Evans would go on to claim that a different method of harm was used entirely, air injected not into the stomach, but into the veins. Something not mentioned in any of the 8 reports he had invoiced for Baby C.
I feel I am obliged to assist the court by saying what are other explanations. From a mechanism point of view, air embolus is one of them.
You just came out with that as we went along to try and support the allegation, didn't you, Dr. Evans?
You keep saying that, and that is not correct.
And again, you are not independent.
Again, you're just being insulting, so there we are.
But what did the jury see here? A long-retired and partisan chancer making it up on the hoof when he'd been busted? Or an honest senior doctor being harassed by a privileged lawyer? The other experts further muddied the waters with Baby C. Neonatologist Sandy Bowen said that she couldn't in fact explain the collapse at all. Meanwhile, a pathologist, Dr. Marnarides, had written a report 3 years earlier saying the cause of death was likely pneumonia. But after the pre-trial meeting, he then suddenly changed his mind and agreed with Evans's reports, which had been written before it emerged Lucy was off duty, leading Evans in turn to come up with a brand new theory on the stand. Astonishingly, Dowie Evans would go on to produce another report a full year after the trial had finished. Apparently belatedly agreeing with his critics who said that air down the breathing tube was impossible as a method of murder, his new report apparently concluded that Lucy Letby used an entirely different mechanism from that on which she had already been convicted. He now confidently told the Daily Telegraph,
Think I've nailed it now?
3 months into the trial, Judge Goss received an unusual email from another judge. Lord Justice Jackson had just presided over an appeal in the family courts that featured another of Dowie Evans's lucrative reports. That judge described the report as worthless, adding that Dr. Evans makes no effort to provide a balanced opinion.
I've never known it happen before. That during a live trial, another judge decides to give that information to the judge. It must have been a really big thing for that judge to do. It's massive. Absolutely, it could have collapsed the case. There's no question about it. That had the real potential of undermining, their key witness. And without Dowie Evans, you could have all the circumstantial evidence in the world, and you weren't going to get a conviction. I hesitate to criticise the judge, but the judge had the option to stop the trial based upon the advice he'd been given by his colleague judge. The decision that Judge Goss took was that the jury would be informed of that and they can make their own mind up.
So it was up to the jury to make any decision about whether they would accept the expert witness's evidence or not.
My personal view, I think that was wrong. I'm not sure that members of juries are able to make those sorts of judgments. I personally think it was too much to ask, but that was the decision of the judge.
The supposedly independent witness, Dr. Evans, liked to boast that he had never lost a case. The jury had already heard Ben Myers claim that Dr. Evans was not independent, but now he had corroboration, from a judge no less. In February,
Ben Myers had his chance as he cross-examined him in front of the jury. He quoted Justice Jackson, who said his report has the hallmarks of an exercise in working out an explanation that exculpates the applicants.
Lord Justice Jackson's decision, as set out in that paragraph, in that agreed fact, accurately describes aspects of your approach to this case generally, doesn't it?
I disagree. That is just making things up and, as usual, being rather insulting, not for the first time.
The arguments continued as the weeks went by, and the letters of the anonymous babies continued to sequentially move up through the alphabet. Baby L was one of the 2 crucial insulin cases where test results were highly alarming. Anna Milan, a clinical biochemist at Liverpool Clinical Laboratories, told the court starkly,
"The only way you get a pattern like that is if insulin has been given to a patient."
If the sample had not been handled correctly, would it affect the reliability of the findings?
It wouldn't create insulin in this sample. The only explanation for the readings in this sample is external administration.
There could be no doubt about her testimony. And since no insulin had been prescribed, this meant there was a poisoner on the unit. What the court did not hear is that Liverpool Lab's own guidance suggested insulin administration was just one explanation. Another was naturally occurring insulin receptor antibodies. Curiously, the lab's webpage was almost impossible to find by the general public or inquisitive lawyers, hidden behind a broken web link. Then there was the small matter of the warning that if external administration of insulin is suspected, as here, these particular tests are not suitable at all. It is not clear why, under oath, Anna Milan seemed to contradict her own lab's guidance. But her absolute certainty did curiously tally with that of endocrinologist Peter Hindmarsh. Unbeknown to the jury and the defence, the General Medical Council opened an investigation into his conduct on the very first day he gave evidence. He ended up removing himself from the GMC register. By April, the prosecution had reached the last baby, Q. But it still wasn't time for the defence to begin. Next came something a little bizarre. Rather than have the court watch the real video of the police interviews with the real Lucy Letby, as mocked up here by Netflix, this was performed instead for the court as live theatre. Even more bizarre was the casting. The role of the interviewer, which in reality was usually the family liaison officer Danielle Stonier, was played by the prosecution barrister Nick Johnson. As for the leading role of Lucy Letby herself, she was played by Danielle Stonier. The families had to watch the police officer they had grown to know and trust over 5 years play the role of the nurse accused of deliberately harming their own children.
I felt like I'd only ever done my best for those babies, and then people were trying to say that my practice wasn't good or that I'd done something, and I couldn't cope. And I did just not want to be here anymore.
The minute that is being delivered by somebody else, however much in good faith and in a well-intentioned way, you're changing the subtle signals and the atmosphere of the questions. Since they had the film available, why not put it before the jury? I've been a juror. I've had bad film and bad recordings put before me to try and make out what they mean. This happens. It's not unusual. I don't believe there's any reason not to put it in there.
The real interview footage, not seen by the jury, would eventually become another Netflix exclusive. By now, it was 7 months after the trial had begun, but it still wasn't time for the defence witnesses. That's because, after 4 days of theatre, on Tuesday the 2nd of May, it was time for the court to finally hear from the woman herself.
We had months and months of her not saying anything, just sitting there while this case is swirling around her, and she was completely impassive. She barely moved, she showed very little emotion. And I started thinking, that the evidence we were listening to was so harrowing about these babies, week after week of really difficult detail, and she showed no emotion. And I thought, is she going to go into the witness box? Is she going to give an account of herself? Because we didn't know that. That was so fascinating when she went into that witness box. 14 days she was there, over the course of a month. It wasn't consecutive days, but that, I think, was the best opportunity any of us had to try to get a sense of her.
Judith Moritz watched for the BBC as Lucy Letby's own lawyer, Ben Myers, began by asking her how she had felt when she discovered that she was being accused of murdering babies that were in her care.
Well, it was sickening. I couldn't believe it. It was devastating. I don't think you can be accused of anything worse than that. And yeah, I was just devastated. I just changed as a person. My mental health deteriorated and I felt very isolated from my friends and family on the unit. I went to my GP. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. I just had a complete change in my whole life, and I was starting on some antidepressants at that point, which I remain on now. They diagnosed me with depression and anxiety at that time. I also take medication to help with sleep. I'm unable to sleep without medication.
How bad did the negative feelings get, so far as you're concerned, about yourself? How bad?
There were times when I didn't want to live.
And what did you want to do? What did it make you think of doing?
To myself?
Yes.
I thought of taking my own life.
Had you done anything wrong?
No.
Why did you think of taking your own life, somebody might ask?
Because of what was being inferred.
How hard had you worked to become a nurse?
Very hard.
And how much did it matter to you?
My job was my life. It was everything.
Ben Myers asks her about her time at the hospital, her Facebook searches of people she met, moving house, her arrests, and her notes found by the police.
Why are you saying I'm an awful person? I pay every day for that right now.
Because at that time, I did feel that I must be an awful person to have made any mistakes that harmed anyone, and that I was paying the price for that by what had happened to me.
And what had happened to you at this point, as best you can remember?
That I'd been taken away from the job that I loved and accused of things that I just hadn't done.
In capitals down at the bottom, we can see the word bastards. Can you see that?
Yeah.
We've seen lots of messages from you, Ms. Letby, and we've seen lots in the notes. Some people swear with complete abandon, and other people don't. Quite a personal thing, swearing. We've not seen you swearing in any text messages, have we?
No, that's not language I would use, no.
Why are you using that language in this note that you're writing for yourself?
Because that's how I felt about some people. And I suppose I could use that word because it was private for me.
Was it directed at any people in particular? Who do you think, looking back?
Ravi Jairam and Steve Berry.
How does it feel inside yourself when, for instance, I ask you questions about the arrest process and you're talking about the banging on the door and things?
It's uncomfortable for me.
Looking at the notes and things, how does that feel?
The same. I'm a very private person and those weren't ever meant to be read.
She clearly does love the attention. I think she's loved the attention of a trial as well. I think we've seen the spurious outbursts of emotion, which shows that she likes the attention.
Lucy cried in court when she was shown pictures of her first house, in which she had lived with her cats for just 2 years before she moved back in with her parents following her arrest. Prosecutor Nick Johnson then demanded to know,
is there any reason that you cry when you talk about yourself, but you don't cry when talking about these dead and seriously injured children?
Yet just a week earlier, the Guardian headline was stark. Lucy Letby did sob over one of the babies. Perhaps Nick Johnson had forgotten. Or perhaps he hadn't, and gaslighting a heavily medicated and depressed woman on trial for her life was just part of the strategy. By the second to last day, as Lucy's parents watched their very private daughter, he found a different way of making her feel awkward, based on a colleague's teasing text message about meeting a male doctor with whom Lucy had become friends.
Where's my underwear?
Whoa. Billy, why can't you just wear the underwear you're wearing now?
Because I'm not wearing any underwear now.
Okay, then why do you have to wear underwear tonight?
It's a rented tux, okay? I'm not gonna go commando in another man's fatigues.
Go commando. You don't understand what that means. Well, you do understand it, because if we go to 114, you found it highly amusing. So what did you understand the message to mean?
I don't know. I can't say right now. I don't know.
Do justice to yourself. What did you understand Go Commando to mean?
I don't know.
After more grilling on the same subject, Judge Goss called a break. BBC reporter Judith Moritz was still in court.
Lucy Letby had never looked so relieved at the prospect of leaving the witness box. Other than the entertainment value, there were some who wondered what the point of all the mickey-taking had been. It didn't seem to have anything to do with whether or not the nurse had attacked babies, at least not at first glance. But Nick Johnson was laying his kindling for a fire he'd ignite later. The next morning, before the jury filed into their seats, Ben Myers KC told the judge that his client hadn't eaten that morning and wasn't feeling well. She'd said she wanted to continue with her evidence, but her browbeaten expression didn't seem to tell the same story.
Just remind us about what happened when you were arrested.
What do you mean?
You really don't remember?
You want me to describe how I was arrested?
Yes. How awful it was and why it was so awful.
I've already explained that once.
Yes, well, it's a long time ago, and I'd like you to remind us, please.
They knocked at my door at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they arrested me.
And how were you dressed when you left the house?
I think I had a nightie on, and then a tracksuit bottom and top and trainers.
Oh, but you told the jury you were taken away in your nightwear, in your pajamas, I think was how you put it.
Yes.
You were taken away in a blue Lee Cooper leisure suit, weren't you?
I don't recall exactly. I just know I had a nightie on.
Do you want me to show you a video of it?
No.
Had Lucy watched that video, she might have seen that under her Lee Cooper tracksuit was what looked suspiciously like a nightshirt. Under a Freedom of Information request in 2026, the CPS claimed that they had never even had footage of the first or second arrests in their possession. One has to ask if Nick Johnson was gaslighting the woman he knew would never watch a moment so traumatic that she had already told the court gave her PTSD. Cheshire Police may not have passed that footage on to the CPS, but they would to Netflix. Subscribers would later be treated to seeing Lucy being arrested all 3 times. And for the other 2, she was in bed, once wearing a dressing gown,
and once a nightshirt.
There were police officers in that court whose job was to monitor what was happening in the prosecution. I think the very minimum they could have done, having heard what the line of questioning was to think to themselves, well, actually, we've got other video of other arrests. We're going to have a quick look at those and see whether or not what he's saying is right. This was a significant part of the prosecution. A lot of play was made about it. It will have influenced the decision of the jury because it went to her honesty and integrity.
In her ringside seat, Judith Moritz had little patience with a heavily medicated Lucy who had imperfectly, but broadly correctly, recalled 5-year-old traumatic events.
She tied herself in knots, she struggled when she was cross-examined, she agreed with things, then she disagreed with things she'd previously agreed. I found that was a central part of my assessment.
However tortuous these exchanges were, nothing would be as damning for Lucy as the 2 insulin cases. At a pre-trial meeting, her own experts had apparently accepted that the critical test results had proved poisoning. The prosecution had come up with a far-fetched theory that even when Lucy was off duty for one of the babies, she had pre-spiked a feed bag with insulin. There was no evidence for this, but however unlikely it was, what was the alternative?
Do you agree that child L was poisoned with insulin?
From the blood results, yes.
As far as I know, Ms. Letby's not an endocrinologist. She's not an expert in immunoassay tests. I'm not sure if she'd even had the tests to analyse and have a look at the results of those. She's effectively saying, if you say so, I guess so.
So it's deliberate poisoning by someone, but not you.
Insulin has been added by somebody. I can't comment on how or who.
And this was turned around and presented by the prosecution as some kind of admission that there was definitely a poisoning on the ward.
But it has only just come to light that something was missed in court. Something pivotal to the entire case against her. And something that shows that Lucy Letby was wrong. Feed bags used in the unit were first brought into the hospital pharmacy. These bags were designed to be tamper-proof, wrapped in cellophane and with tamper-evident caps. Some were then made by pharmacists into bespoke prescription bags by physically snapping the tamper-evident cap, adding vitamins and base minerals, and then replacing with their own cap. The court heard from the head of the hospital pharmacy. Although their replacement caps were designed not to be removed, in practice, in 2015, it was possible to tamper with prescription bags.
Do you remember him demonstrating how you can take the supposedly tamper-proof cap off a bag of TPN?
Yes.
And inject insulin into the bag?
Yes.
And the tiny amount of insulin that's required to produce results like this?
Yes, but the bags in the fridge are sealed, so you'd have to break the seal to do that.
On this, Lucy was exactly right. When she was on night duty, the nurses were infusing from a prescription bag that was possible to tamper with. But at 8 a.m, she went off duty. Those critical test results, which supposedly proved poisoning, were taken when the second bag was infusing, one of the stock bags specifically engineered with a snap mechanism to be blindingly obvious if tampered with. But Nick Johnson completely ignored Lucy's critical point.
Yes, you either do it as the bag is being put up, and who was putting up the bag? Just remind us.
Myself and Nurse A.
Yes, or you do it once the bag is up, and you were there, weren't you?
I was there when the bag was hung, yes.
Like a magician, Nick Johnson switched it. He seamlessly went from the all-important stock bag in the fridge that couldn't be tampered with to the one that could. And apparently, nobody noticed. The only mechanism the prosecution alleged regarding tampering related to the prescription bag. It was simply impossible with the stock bag, still wrapped in cellophane, with a genuine tamper-evident snap cap, hung by other nurses when Lucy was at home, in bed, asleep. Much like the defence were apparently asleep, while a bewildered Lucy got it wrong. It now appears it wasn't physically possible for anyone to have added insulin undetected to baby F's second bag when the critical test results were taken. And sure enough, years later, peer-reviewed research would find the specific tests used were highly sensitive to a process called bound insulin. Results such as those seen in the case can be perfectly natural and not uncommon for babies in those circumstances. But the jury were told poisoning was simple. In his summing up, Nick Johnson told them,
But we all saw the debunking of the so-called tamper-proof port myth, didn't we? When Mr. Allen showed you exactly how the supposed tamper-proof port can be bypassed.
Of course, this only applied to the first bag. But he then went on to allege
the first bag, the bespoke bag, was contaminated. Easy to do the same thing to the stock bag at the front of the fridge.
It wasn't easy. Using a needle to get through the manufacturer's tamper-evident snap cap was, in fact, impossible. But since the defence didn't even spot his error, how could the jury be expected to? "9 months after the start of the trial, at long last the defence had their chance to call their own witnesses. First up was a surprise, a plumber. He described grim conditions, floods, sewage in wash basins, and being called out weekly to deal with problems. In one incident, there was sewage in the nursing intensive care unit. And then, the bombshell. That was the entirety of the defence's witnesses. No neonatologists, no statisticians, no lab scientists, just a plumber.
And then that was it. It was surreal.
Guardian reporter Josh Halliday was there for the entire trial.
That moment in court of knowing there wouldn't be any defense experts was just so shocking and unexpected that it's one of the most surprising things I've ever seen in court.
So what had happened to the two experts who were at the pre-trial meeting? One was a neonatologist.
Dr. Hall.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
When I found out that I wasn't going to be called to give evidence, or indeed that nobody else was going to be called to give evidence, I couldn't believe it, because I could not see how a fair process could possibly occur without some rebuttal of the evidence, particularly the medical evidence, which had been provided to the jury.
Were you given a reason?
No, I wasn't.
You don't worry that you may have put an innocent woman in jail?
Good God, no. No. She's as guilty as they can be.
You're sure of that?
Yes.
Dr. Hall was not sure.
Do you think Lucy Letby is innocent?
I don't know whether Lucy Letby is innocent, but in terms of natural justice, I don't think that she should have been found guilty.
The prosecution expert witness was making very categorical statements about matters which really weren't categorical. Our embolus is a classic case. Now, the defense expert sitting through the trial had the view that, well, air embolus is possible because it's non-specific. There's a number of things that could cause this. Air embolus is possible, but highly unlikely. It opens the way for a prosecution barrister's cross-examination. So you're saying that it could be air embolus. You can't rule it out, can you? No, I can't rule it out. Sit down. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, even the defense witness can't rule out air embolus, whereas our witness was perfectly certain that this is air embolus. You decide. So, to my mind, not at all surprising that the defense didn't call their rebutting expert evidence. The other thing was, if you wait 6 months and then bring back to life these suggestions of Dr. Evans and try and knock them over again, you're only reminding the jury of something that the jury may have forgotten about, or they may have written off because they've seen it so comprehensively demolished. So this is a tactical decision that a defense barrister has to make. Do I call expert evidence here, or do I rely on the job that I have done?
Judge Goss then addressed the jury and gave them a very strange instruction. After all the confused and confusing evidence, if they didn't know exactly how Lucy Letby had harmed babies, they could convict her anyway. They just had to be sure she harmed them, somehow.
This is a case where we don't know there was a murder at all. So it seems to me, in this particular case, that judge's direction was not appropriate. It seems to me that if the jury wasn't sure exactly what Ms. Letby did, they couldn't have no reasonable doubt that she was guilty of a crime.
For an exhausted and doubtless bewildered jury, finally it was time to summarise everything. That summary would use more words than 3 Tolkien novels. Starting on day 131, the first week was the prosecution, more words than The Hobbit. Week 2 was the defence, bigger than The Two Towers. And week 3 was the judge, just a gram or 2 lighter than The Return of the King. For the prosecution, it was perhaps all a bit much. So to break things up, they scheduled another press conference, just over the road, timed for journalists to skip that day's summing up by the defence. By all accounts, they had a great time. Lucy Letby was sat alone, listening to her barrister deliver her final hope of freedom. The jury began their long deliberations. At one point, they asked the judge for clarification regarding insulin. Although we now know it was impossible to have been given as alleged for baby F, Judge Goss himself, not just the prosecution, told the jury that insulin had undoubtedly been given. It was August the 8th, 2023, when the jury foreman read out their first 2 verdicts, both on the insulin cases. Guilty. Unable to be reported at the time, the Daily Telegraph recorded,
As those verdicts were handed down, the neonatal nurse broke down and sobbed uncontrollably.
Despite being told by the judge that insulin administration was certain, and knowing there were no other suspects, one can only speculate why it had taken the long-suffering jury nearly a full calendar month to make their first decisions, both on the insulin cases. But now, another direction from the judge came into play. He told them that if they found in just one case Lucy had deliberately harmed a baby, they were entitled to consider how likely it was
that the other collapses were caused by her too.
The moment you think, oh, okay, that one looks quite bad, then you start to feel quite differently about the other ones. And the court encouraged the jury that they could feel quite different about the other ones.
Judge Goss also told the jury that they no longer had to reach a unanimous verdict. Already down to 11 after one juror was excused, now just agreement among 10 would do. As the days rolled on, the verdicts came in thick and fast. Only one of these was unanimous. 12 more were guilty, 2 not guilty, 6 had no verdict. Finally, with all the verdicts in, on August the 18th, Judith Moritz could burst out of the courthouse to tell the nation the exciting news that she had been holding on to for days.
She's guilty. The jury's found Lucy Letby guilty of murdering 7 babies.
The reporting restrictions were finally lifted.
Tonight, the untold story of Britain's most unlikely serial killer.
And the nation heard the evidence on which Lucy had been convicted.
It was quite clear that this baby had been poisoned by insulin.
Lucy Letby was always there. She was working on the unit during every single one of the 25 suspicious incidents.
But they also heard one dissenting voice.
Hereford is definitely very much home for her. Lucy, has such strong ties to her family here.
Lucy's childhood friend, Dawn.
Think of your most kind, gentle, soft friend, and think that they're being accused of harming babies. She is the kindest person that I've ever known. She would only ever want to help people. To say that she could have harmed any baby, it's just not in her nature. Not a single thing that I've ever seen or witnessed of Lucy would, let me for a moment believe that she was capable of the things she was being accused of.
You are now to be sentenced for your crimes.
3 days after the verdict, Dawn's softest friend was unable to be physically brought to the sentencing. Judge Goss delivered his brutal judgment to a blank wall.
Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
The devastated parents also had no one to whom they could deliver their own words.
I think it's cowardly that people who commit such horrendous crimes do not face their victims and hear firsthand the impact that their crimes have had on them and their families and loved ones.
It is not hard to imagine an alternative explanation to cowardice, where Dawn's kindest, softest friend, an empath who had dedicated her life to helping others, broke down completely at the thought of hearing from parents who believed she had deliberately harmed and killed their babies. It wasn't many weeks until reporting restrictions returned, on the announcement that one child, baby Kay, would be retried.
That is a night that is etched on my memory and will be in my nightmares forever.
In court, Ravi Jayaram gave his powerful testimony that he'd walked in behind Lucy Letby, silently doing nothing, as a baby desaturated. He had initially said nothing about this for over a year, and the jury would never hear that, unlike what he said under oath, he told colleagues in an email she first called him for help. But there was more. It transpired that the police managed to get the door swipe data used in the main trial back to front. People were not always where the first jury had been told they were. In the original trial, Dr. Ravi told the court he had been absolutely certain about his timings and remembered checking his watch at 3:50 a.m. before going into Nursery 1. In an awkward interview, the police told him the data now said otherwise.
Yeah, we can't change the data. Okay. But we can change the interpretation of it.
So they did. They changed the time of the alleged attack so it fit the corrected data. But that now meant a different young blonde nurse would have just resumed working in Nursery 1, and now the obvious choice to keep an eye on baby K. Another critical detail seemingly missed by Lucy's defence.
The nurse looking after the baby said she was popping to the delivery suite to go and talk to the parents, and she said, "I've left Lucy in there babysitting."
That nurse has no memory of asking Lucy, working in a different room, to do this. Lucy herself doesn't remember it. The only witness who said they did was Dr. Ravi. Could his unreliable memory mean in reality he walked in behind an entirely different young blonde nurse who had called him for help? The judge allowed jurors to take Lucy's previous convictions into account, and this time the jury reached their guilty verdict in just 3.5 hours. After the sentencing, Lucy turned to the judge and said the last 2 words she has ever spoken in public.
I'm innocent.